Good evening. I'll call to order the workshop for the Arvada City Council for May 22nd, 2017. I'll begin by thanking Mayor Pro Tem Bob Pfeiffer for running the council meeting last week while I was down in Peru. And so with that, we'll have our four workshops. Mr. Devon, you want to start us off?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we have two special guests here who will be presenting information. They are representing the community outreach team at the ARC of Jefferson, Clear Creek, and Gilpin counties, and I'll let them introduce themselves and start their presentation.
Very good. Good evening.
Good evening, and thanks so much for having us come and speak. David and I get very excited when anyone wants to listen to us. So I'm Valerie Smith, and I'm the Community Outreach Manager. And this is my coworker, David Eaton. And together we like to go out into the community and we like to change people's perceptions about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So with that, my understanding is that we have an hour to present. Is that your understanding as well?
No, it was not.
It was not. Well, we can talk really, really fast.
That would be good.
Tell me.
Yeah, I think a half hour would be
Half hour? Fantastic.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Good.
We can absolutely do that. So here's why we're here tonight. We want to talk a little bit about, what's our main mission? Why does the ARC exist, and why is that important? A lot of people think that we are actually the thrift stores, which maybe you've heard about or shopped there or donated there. We are separate organizations, but there is a connection because 83% of our funding comes from the thrift stores. So that kind of dispels some myths that all ARC is only the thrift stores. Oops. And David has quite an interesting story, so he's going to share that with you tonight. And another thing we want to talk about is how important awareness and inclusion of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is to all of our communities. And as the community leaders, we're delighted to be able to give that message to you tonight. We came prepared with some specific examples that might make it easier for you to make Arvada an even more inclusive community. So I'm going to ask you to go back about 58 years to 1959 in Jefferson County. And there were families who had children with disabilities like Down syndrome, autism, cerebral palsy, and they would go to their doctors, and the doctors would say, well, the best place for your children is in an institution. And these parents wanted something different, something better for their kids. They wanted their kids to be able to be part of the community and be raised at home and go to school just like all the other kids. So the doctors would say, but this is the best place for your children. Everything is there, and you shouldn't feel bad about leaving them in an institution. So they persevered. They weren't swayed by that advice, and they decided to come together and organize and create resources pretty much from scratch. And so the ARC is a national organization. Once they got to a certain point, they decided they were going to be their own chapter of the ARC, and that was in 1960. So that was the beginning of our chapter. So there has been, part of this growth involved the creation of the community-centered boards, or the CCBs. And you may have heard of the organization called DDRC. That's the community-centered board serving our area. Rocky Mountain Human Services is serving the Denver area. So there are multiple community-centered boards, and they provide extremely valuable services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So David, could you share a little bit about what kind of services DDRC provides to you?
DDRC is like the middleman. They make sure that I get the services that I need from other agencies, and that they take care of me quite well. And so they're kind of like the overseer of everything that I get.
And so at DDRC, David has a resource coordinator that can help organize the services he receives from other agencies as well. So we also have more support in our schools. There's no doubt about that over the decades. And we also have a lot more transportation options. However, take it from David, there's a long way to go with transportation. One of the biggest issues for the people that we serve is around transportation. Would you say that's true?
Yes, it's definitely true. It makes me feel like I just want to buy some bungee cords and tie them to people's bumpers and just get a ride, because transportation is the largest problem in our community. It's hard to be part of anything.
As you can see, David is fearless, and we've had to talk to him a lot about not actually trying the bungee cord and the skitching idea. So regardless, we do have a lot more legislation that protects the rights of people with intellectual disabilities, but there's a lot more work to do, and that's why the ARC exists. There's clearly a very big need for us. So we're a national organization, and we have about 700 chapters across the United States. 13 of them are in Colorado, and there is also a statewide ARC, the ARC of Colorado. So you may be familiar with us from the past as ARC, as an acronym, and that stood for Association of Retarded Citizens. And I don't know if you're like me, but when I hear the R word, I just kind of cringe and feel icky. And so it's not a term that we want to use anymore nor encourage. And so we are simply the ARC, capital A, lowercase rc, like the sheltering and protective shape of an ARC. So I mentioned this earlier, but the ARC thrift store connection is really what keeps us focusing on what we need to do instead of raising money. And if you ever shop or donate to the ARC, you're indirectly supporting the work that we do. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that is. Oops. Oh, before we go there, let's talk a little bit about what's called people first language. Has anybody heard that term? People first language. Well, it's pretty self-explanatory. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they want to be defined as people first. They don't want to be defined by their disability. So, for example, David doesn't want to be the disabled guy. David is a million more things than that. He is wicked smart, has an amazing sense of humor, and we would simply refer to him as David, and maybe we would say, and he has a developmental disability. For example, if you see a little girl with crutches, she is simply the girl with a physical disability or developmental disability. Or maybe you live next to someone who is quote unquote insane. But with people first language, you would say this person has a mental health condition. So it's about choosing our words to describe people in the best light possible, in the most positive way. So you'll hear us say intellectual and developmental disabilities a lot. And we also may shorten that to IDD because I only have half hour. So our mission specifically is to promote and protect the rights of people with IDD. And the second part of our mission is to support the full inclusion and participation in the community throughout their whole lives. So we work with people who are newborn babies that may have Down syndrome. We also help people who may be at the end of their life, and we may be involved in making some of those decisions. If people don't have natural supports, we may actually help with their burial plan and literally through the very end of their life. So in terms of Arvada's population, we're talking about 4,500 people. In Colorado, it's about 3.9% of people have an intellectual or a developmental disability. So specifically what we do ranges from people may call with a simple question, and we give them the answer and send them on their way with that information. We also help people on a one-on-one basis. Maybe they are homeless and they have no family, no friends to help. We can help get them connected with the resources that could literally mean the difference between them being on the streets or not. We do a lot of training and education for all different phases of life, and we participate at the systemic level whenever possible so that we can help affect change at the highest level. So one of the things that we focus on, big picture, is we help people help themselves. We work with some groups of adults with disabilities, and we try and create events to help empower them. David, did you want to talk about some of the ways that we help people help themselves and advocate for themselves?
We help people by helping them believe in themselves that they can build dreams and goals. We also help them to overcome things that hold them back with their disability to build up more confidence.
Well said, David. And David is one of the most inspiring people that I've ever met. And we go and speak sometimes, and people just, one gentleman one time said, "David, I've never met anybody like you." And he was just, emotion was flowing out of him. So having David, who lives the experience, speak about it is a million times more powerful than anything I could ever say. So now let's talk a little bit about your story. Okay, what was it like when you were very young?
It wasn't very easy. I was only allowed to go to school and go to the doctors. I had very little interaction with the public.
So what was your school like when you were in elementary school?
What my school's like is I went to Fletcher Miller, and that school was only teaching me enough to go from one program to another program. They didn't really expect me to really go outside of these programs.
So something changed for you when you got to the end of elementary school and toward middle school. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yep. Well, when I went to a regular school, it just changed. The ball game just changed. I had a teacher that didn't really have very much confidence in what I can do, and she was telling my homeroom teacher that she didn't really think that I should be in there. Well, lucky for me, the computers weren't working right. So I showed the class how to run the computer, and since then, her opinion has changed about me. I've gone from not having any of intelligence to she wants me in her class.
I'm sure that was a sweet moment. And I understand that you met somebody who was very important in your life during that time as well.
Well, I met her when I was at Fletcher Miller, but the relationship really took off when we went into the regular schools. I am from foster care. I didn't say that earlier because I'm trying to keep this very short. The foster care family asked the mother that I became friends with if she would take over and see what I can do, if she would watch over me, and that was her big mistake.
So David, what is your life like now?
My life is, I live in my own apartment. I work at the Arc and encouraging people with disabilities to be the best that they can be. And I still play my video games. I think I'll be playing until I'm 90 years old.
So one of David's primary roles is also just being an amazing example to the other people that we work with and to help them see what's possible within themselves. So David, would you say that once you were included in the greater community, well, just tell us, how'd that affect your life, big picture?
All right. When I was included in the community, it did a lot for me. It increased my awareness. It gave me bigger dreams for myself. And it also helped me beat the odds. Because as you notice, if we're not included, we don't think very highly of ourselves.
So I found a definition of inclusion that I thought was excellent. It talks about, it's built on the premise that all people should be valued for their unique abilities and included as essential members of community. It's a way of thinking, it's not just a practice. And it looks like some of you have already determined this, but we had handed out some folders that have this presentation in it if you wanted to follow along. So it's so true that people with IDD are much more included and accepted than they ever have been. But based on conversations with the people that we work with, a lot of people still feel very overlooked, very underestimated. In fact, David, I think, is chronically underestimated. But once you get to know him, you realize exactly what he's capable of. And so we don't believe that this is any kind of intentional situation. This is, maybe people just haven't learned what people with IDD are capable of. And so that's why David and I are here. And I'm sure some of you know people with disabilities, and they have a lot of wonderful abilities as well. So we talk about what our truth is regarding people with disabilities. We spend a lot of time with a group called People First. We spend time with a group called Speaking for Ourselves. We do a lot of speaking to various groups of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So David, what would you say some of the things are that are the truth about people with IDD?
The truth is that we just want to be involved in your lives and to go to movies and to have fun and to have jobs and to have responsibilities. Even though I have to keep this short, this is very important. I will say this. It's nice to have the world say, will this give you this? Will this give you everything that you asked for? Well, it doesn't quite work that way. We have responsibilities too. If we want to be involved in the community, we have to be patient and understanding that not everybody understands people with disabilities. We cannot assume because we have a disability that people will say, okay, we have to be nice to you and here you go. No, we also have to be assertive and put ourselves out there.
Well said, David. And I just wanted to highlight one of the things you said at the beginning was people with disabilities just want to be like everyone else. Have a significant other, have their own place, have their own job. I'm sure that's no surprise to any of you. So some of the barriers to inclusion, I'm going to have David talk about that because he lives it.
The barriers to inclusion is that, unfortunately, people with disabilities do not have the income to pay for everything that we need. The biggest barrier that we have is transportation. So, you want to be in the community, so will you pay us? Well, no. And I would like to show you an example. It's very quickly. I think you guys are already there, but I'm going to do it anyway. Imagine that you're about 50 years older and you've lost all of your abilities and you need help brushing your teeth, and you say, I need help brushing my teeth, and they say, sorry, it's not in your plan. That's how it feels like with somebody with a disability, that we just want to be involved. But truthfully, to be really involved is, we just need people that are compassionate enough to help us be involved, because we don't have the income to pay what people are asking.
That really hit home to me when David told me that example. It was great. it was great perspective for me. So sometimes the barriers to inclusion can be physical, like accessibility into someplace they want to go. David encounters this numerous times just over the course of a week. Paying attention to accessibility issues is really something that is appreciated for someone who uses a wheelchair. Sometimes people may not understand very much about people with disabilities, and they may tend to not want to engage. They don't know how that interaction will go. Maybe you don't know how that person will respond or if they can respond. From what David was saying, you can expect the person with disabilities to also have a part in that and speak up if they need you to speak up, or to make some sort of gesture that lets you know they don't understand. So it's not all on the responsibility of the person without the disability. So when there are lots of physical challenges, like David was mentioning, transportation, the accessibility issue, how does that affect you and your peers on the inside?
I am strong-skinned and strong-willed, so I am very fortunate that I have this skill, but a lot of us do not have this skill. When people say that they need money for us to get the help that we need, sometimes what that does to us is it makes us go in our own little shell. Well, they need money to help us, so we start to say, okay, so they can make the decision of what we will do with our lives. And some of us, I hate to say this, but it's true, because we can't make our own decisions, some of us will just say, okay, I give you everything, and they lose their ability to make a choice, their free will. They will say, it's not my choice, ask my provider. It's not my choice, ask somebody else. You could ask them, do you like this movie? It's not my choice, ask my provider if I can go. They will lose their free will, and they will feel very alone inside, but they won't tell you this.
So David and I focus on being that connection piece between our community of people with disabilities and the greater community, to help that understanding and to help remind people that they do have a voice and that they do have power inside them. So some suggestions that we have for municipalities that we talk to include just an awareness and a mindset, to focus on the abilities of the person instead of perhaps a very visible disability. Maybe you just have to kind of remind yourself to look past that to the abilities. Also, we would like to let you all know that there are a lot of people with disabilities who would love to volunteer at city events, maybe in some sort of a project that you have going on, and we know a lot of people. And so if you ever wanted to reach out to us and let us know of a volunteer opportunity, that would be great. We have lots of people who want to give. And I'm not sure what your committee or subcommittee structure would be, if there's any room for something like this, but we would just encourage you to maybe consider someone with intellectual or developmental disabilities in an advisory role, or maybe a seat on a subcommittee if that fits with your mission. And also, one other point is visibility is so key to the community, including people with disabilities. And it could be as simple as including someone with a visible disability in your marketing materials or on your website or something of that nature. And I know I'm getting really close to our time.
You're doing okay.
And so those are sort of, city-related things that might be able to be done to promote inclusion. But as simply citizens of Arvada, I would say there are some things where you could just say hi, like we mentioned earlier. Don't be too hesitant to engage with people who maybe that would make their day. Maybe they don't get a lot of hello, what's your name? That can make a big difference. And it's important, don't feel like you have to change how you talk. Just be yourself, and then just treat people with IDD like you'd treat anyone else. I mean, David, I give you just as hard a time as I do anybody else, right? Oh yeah, yes he does. And so why is it important? Well, we just have a little bit more to tell you. These are some of the benefits for the entire community. It's a learning experience. We all learn each other's differences, and we learn to accept each other more. It benefits the whole community because it fosters more relationships. And when you have a community that's better interconnected, everybody wins. And then the result is that when we have true inclusion, the community is richer and more diverse. Who could argue with that? So now we would like to say, how can we help you? David and I would like to offer sort of a partnership, if you're open to that, where we can be a resource for City of Arvada. If there's any kind of question about language, what's the proper language to use if we're reaching out to people with disabilities? If you wanted to let us know about an event where maybe we could provide some volunteers. But we're here for you if you just need information or perspective or whatnot. Did you want to say something else, David?
If people with disabilities get a spot, you may start opening up a new awareness that they may not even realize what they had. To be a leader, somebody else has to believe in us.
So with that, I would just like to say that we're open to any questions if there's time or if there are any.
Great. Mr. Marriott?
I just have a couple questions for you. I think in your presentation you mentioned that you guys serve about 4,500 people in Arvada.
Yes, that was an estimate of what kind of population we're talking about within Arvada.
Okay.
We don't know, definitely all of them are not in contact
that's
with
fine.
us, but yes.
That's fine.
Okay.
And what size of a population do you think you serve in your whole area? So your county, Jefferson, Clear Creek, and Gilpin counties.
Last statistics said it was 13,000 people.
Okay. And then one last thing, just to get an idea of the size of an impact you have in our community. What's your budget overall for service within our community? Do you have any idea?
I really don't.
Not sure.
I
Okay.
hate to end it on a I don't know, but that's
No,
all
that's
I
okay.
got.
Fair enough. I just trying to get an idea of kind of the size and scope of your programs within our community.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Any other questions? Fair enough. Well, okay, go ahead.
I have one left. What's your dog's name?
My dog's name is Havana.
And how in the world did you train him to act like that? Because I've never had a dog that would do that.
Truthfully, I did it on my own because I found in my own experience that when you take it to actual classes, they prefer you not to touch the dog. I'm like, that won't do me any good if she's skittish. So I encourage people to hang out with my dog and talk to my dog because that helps me out. A skittish dog is a dangerous dog. I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, you did a great job.
Yes,
Thanks.
very good.
And I can show you her favorite trick if you like. Oh, yeah. Havana, time to get up, girl. Jump.
It's great. Well, Valerie and David, thank you very much for your presentation. And you did a great job. You brought us some good information. Arvada prides itself. In fact, we've got a sign in town that says we're building an inclusive community. So this fits right in with our ultimate goals.
That's wonderful, and I tuned into that on your mission as well, that the inclusive team. So I know that we're on the same page.
Very good. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Have a great evening.
You too.
Okay, Mr. Devon, next we're going to talk about potential 2018 federal budget impacts.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Housing Manager Ed Talbot will present this item for you.
Mr. Talbot doesn't get an hour either, so.
I heard you loud and clear.
Yes, you usually do.
Well, I have one thing to announce, and then before I move on, it's the most important thing you're going to hear tonight. I'm celebrating my wedding anniversary of 35 years.
Well, congratulations. That's great. Our condolences to your wife.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't know how she did it. It still sticks with me, and frankly, I'm not sure how you guys have stuck with me as long as you have, actually. So, on to the subject at hand.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I'd like to take at least a brief moment, obviously, to take to explore what some of the potential federal budget impacts are out there as we start off on the 2018 federal budget process. And the reason to do this is that we're seeing the potential for some really significant changes relative to funding, and those have implications for the community. So it's good to get this information, I believe, to you, and we believe to you, so that you can be thinking ahead about what this might mean for us over time. So we're going to try to touch on 4 points, is that historic federal funding levels, to give maybe a mile-high view, proposed 2018 federal budget blueprint. And this is looking back to the blueprint from March. And I'll touch a little bit based on where we're at right now with this process. And what would be the impact? What might be that range of loss, so that we can take a look at what those impacts potential will be, depending how the appropriations process goes as we go through the year. And then maybe for any questions or thoughts on any next steps or policy direction you may want to bring up. So with the, whoops, wrong button. So what I'd like to ask is Brian to come up to give that mile-high view, and then we're going to dig down a little deeper.
Great. Mr. Archer.
Mayor, Council, so I just got done attending the GFOA seminar, and the one thing they said is don't put charts and graphs in front of your council because they don't read them. So the next 2 charts and graphs are nothing but numbers, so I apologize for that. But you're used to that from me. Ultimately, what you'll see here is all of the federal dollars that the city has received. We did include the Ralston House. While that's not a city function, we did want to reflect that they do receive a lot of money from the last 3 years on an actual basis. And then 17 and 18 is what our current 2-year budget shows. Would like to point out that the largest 2 items are CDBG and housing, but we have received federal dollars in many different areas, including the general fund, the TI funds, and some capital projects. This one puts it on an actual program basis. So again, you see CDBG and housing reflected. The police does take advantage of as many federal grants as they can get their hands on. The JAG grant, very popular. The HIDA grant, very popular. Council should remember from a couple years ago, we received the COPS grant, Citizen-Oriented Policing Services. We're very excited to be receiving that. That runs out in 2018, but did allow us to hire 7 new police officers. We did apply for and receive multiple federal grants related to various projects. They all fall under what's called highway planning, but to give them some context, Kipling Trail, the Kipling Underpass, the Ridge Road extension, and the 56th Avenue extension are the dollars that you see up there. Finally, with RTD, we are receiving some pass-through federal dollars helping us related to the transit hub. Any questions?
Don't see any.
Okay, I'll pass it back to Mr.
Great.
Talbot.
Thanks. Thanks, Brian. So we're going to basically get a little bit deeper into what was called at the time the initial blueprint that was released back in March, called America First, a budget blueprint to make America great again. Obviously, this came out of the Office of the President. So when we're looking at the 2018 federal budget blueprint, we do see a variety of eliminations that were proposed. And I'm going to just take a moment because the actual budget, this was the blueprint back in March. The actual budget's going to be released tomorrow. That's when it is scheduled. We're able to get a copy of a leaked copy, at least on the HUD side, so we could kind of take a look at the blueprint relative to what it appears the budget proposals will be in more detail, and they do actually pretty closely align, at least on the HUD side where I could see that. But this just gives you an idea that there is a lot of programs that are out there that are proposed for elimination. Okay. And of course, the ones that are probably most important to us, and I'm going to touch a little more depth in a little more depth on those, is CDBG and the Section 8 housing payments program that helps very low-income citizens in the city. So when we look at the budget blueprint as it relates to HUD, we're seeing elimination or deep cuts in community development programs. CDBG, Home, there's several others, are prominent in the fact that they are proposed for elimination. Overall, we're seeing that 13.2% decrease, around $6 billion, for the HUD budget going from 2017 going into 2018. So that is a significant cut. Potential impacts when we're looking at Arvada.
Mr. Marriott's got a question.
Can I just
You please.
ask you a quick question, make sure I'm understanding that right? That last slide says proposed budget blueprint, the 13.2% decrease in HUD's budget for 2000.
That is correct. Thank you for the clarification.
So what it begs to me is a question of a history. At what rate was HUD's budget growing prior to that? Like how far back is that cutting them? Is that cutting them back by 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, or how far back does that actually cut them?
The one that I'd like to, when we get to it, is I have a really specific slide that'll show you the slide funding for CDBG. Okay, and that'll kind of give you a picture for that cut. But you're talking overall.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, HUD is the one that authorizes the CDBG funding.
Correct.
HUD may choose to spend its money in different ways besides just CDBG. In other words, they've
Correct.
got a whole menu of things they fund. I'm more just curious whether you knew the answer to, you know, if next year is a 13% cut in HUD funding, overall federal HUD funding, you know, was it growing at 5% a year prior to that? Was it growing at 12% a year prior to that? Was it growing at no percent a year prior to that? I mean, within the landscape, how much of a cut is that really?
Okay, and it's a good question. I don't have specific figures, but the big drivers on the federal side of the budget in HUD has been the housing assistance programs, primarily Section 8. Okay, and I'm not talking FHA. I'm kind of leaving the FHA off to the side for mortgage insurance and such. But taking a look at entitlement programs, for example, or Section 8, we actually have seen a general level or somewhat of an increase over the last, and I can't put a frame on it, but let's say the last few years. So we haven't seen a steep decline at all that would compare to what is proposed going from 2017 to 2018. We've actually seen probably, I would call it a gradual increase that's driven by the need to, for the biggest programs that are funded, which might be public housing and Section 8, for example. Okay. So when we're looking at some of these programs basically in the blueprint, the ones that are most important are the Community Development Block Grant and the Section 8. And I'm not going to read all these to you, obviously, but to point out that there's a variety of programs and why we should be thinking about these and looking forward, that even though we may not be going for some, or we haven't applied for some of these programs, there's still capabilities and options for us in the future if they were still around, even if we're not utilizing them presently. The one, it's the second dot from the bottom, Community Services Block Grant. That's funding that goes to the county, and that funding actually provides for a variety of human and public services that come through the county. We don't access it directly, but it does have benefit to citizens within our community by way of the services that are provided at the county level. So looking again at that blueprint, we touched on this. So if we're looking at specifically those HUD programs that would touch us, okay, again, not everything that we've accessed, but again, the potential as well in the future. The big ones, the Community Development Block Grant Program, obviously, is an important one to us, and we'll take a look at that. Home investment partnerships, we have accessed that in the past, and we've actually supported funding applications for home by nonprofits who've actually developed housing in the city. That has been part of the funding package. We're not a what's called a PJ. We don't qualify directly for those funds, but we can apply on a competitive basis. Again, there's a variety of programs there that on the HUD side do have impact for us, or could have potential impact in the future if we wanted to access them, if they're still there. Oops, I keep hitting the wrong button. My apologies. So the overall benefit of the CDBG program, and this is looking at the large cloud, is that it has a proven ability to provide essential support for local priorities. That's important. that benefit low and moderate income persons and help revitalize and stabilize neighborhoods and communities that have limited resources. And I would say most communities obviously are limited in their resources. And to use those to invest and maintain the quality of life for mainly low and moderate income residents. And then when we take a step down, and what's that value of the program for Arvada that we've seen during the time we've utilized this program since 1975? One is its flexibility. The beauty of the CDBG, it allows you folks to make decisions within certain constraints about how to properly apply those funds in the community. That's not the case with every type of federal grant that's out there. And those three things that we can do is benefit low and moderate income, we can eliminate slums or blighting conditions, or meet other urgent community needs. Another beauty for us has been, it's a consistent annual funding source. We don't compete for it. We obtain the money by way of a formula. And that depends on appropriations, and then it runs and goes into the computer, and the dollars are spit out in terms of what will come to the community. But we have a relatively, so long as we follow the rules, sustained capability to access this program, which is good because we can plan on that. One thing you can do with CDBG you can't do with a lot of federal grants, you can match other federal grants with it. That was a value that was built in, so that can actually help you in leveraging it. And here in Arvada, by the fact that we have that consistent level of annual funding, it allows you to maintain a consistent local capacity and structure, a staffing capability to properly apply and utilize these funds. And a big one is collaboration and partnerships. You and your staff have worked hard to try to basically leverage the use of this funding in working with other nonprofits, with First Bank and others, to try to leverage the use of this funding to get a bigger bang for the buck to benefit the community. So how we used this money, say over the last, what would that be? I'm talking about my wedding anniversary, think I could count this high. And from 1975 to 2017, roughly half of that's been used for housing rehab, and that's essentially the Essential Home Repairs Program. We've used about a quarter for public facilities in our low and moderate income neighborhoods, public services about 10%, then we have planning and admin and others. Darn, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button, my apologies. And this gets back to Councilman Marriott's question, at least specifically on CDBG. And you can see since the start, frankly, of the generation we're in, starting 2001, we had a fairly consistent funding level, but we've been dropping pretty consistently since 2001 from a high of about 700,000 to a little over 400,000 now. And these aren't adjusted for inflation, these are straight dollars. So let's dig a little bit as what the impacts and the value have been for the CDBG program in the last 3 years. We've seen the Essential Home Repairs Program with expenditures at that time of about $1.2, $1.3 million, and CDBG has funded 95% of that program. That is the funding source. And that's allowed us to provide those funding vehicles there to our citizens who qualify for the program, including the capitalization of a revolving loan fund, and then working with our First Bank partners to capitalize 0 and 3% loans. City support to human services, back to that partnership and collaboration. And that is indeed provided about, over the last 3 years, 36% of the total city obligations or expenditures is $630,000. So it's been significant in allowing us to expand that capability to work with our partners out there like the Caring Clinic, Ralston House, Jeffco Mental Health, and others. Infrastructure. We've had 3 primary infrastructure projects in the last 3 years, the reconstruction of Creekside and Memorial Neighborhood Parks, one of those being an award-winning park, and then the pending reconstruction of Carr Street down in the southeast part of Arvada. So we're looking at that, total cost at around $2.2 million. CDBG has provided 66% of the resources for these infrastructure projects, and we know infrastructure is important to the community. And one I can't put a dollar amount to, but it's that loss of capability or capacity through our regional and county partners and colleagues out there that also access CDBG funds. And through the services and programs they provide, actually buttress and actually increase that level of support to help citizens who are lower moderate income or meet the qualifications for which the money can be used. And just as one example in essential repairs, how this really kind of reflects and has helped us in looking at this particular program, because we're facing that silver tsunami, something that I know is of concern, obviously, to us. And 69% of the funding over the last 10 years, in terms of, I shouldn't say funding, 69% of the clients that have benefited through that program in the last 10 years have been elderly clients. And it's been an important program for us to basically provide services through that program to the elderly homeowners in the community. So, shifting to Section 8, and when we put this slide together, this was again based on March and the budget blueprint. And it wasn't quite unsure what that'll be, but now we have a little bit more in terms of numbers. And what we're looking at right now, bear with me a second, is that they obviously passed, it was an omnibus bill, but they passed the funding appropriations for 2017. We got about 3 months left before the end of the fiscal year. Remembering the federal fiscal year, it goes from October 1st to September 30th when we're looking at the funding that comes from the federal government. 2017, once we saw the final numbers, the overall program, this isn't for Arvada, but we haven't seen the numbers yet for Arvada, but hopefully they'll probably be reflective. We're going to have to count on about a 97% proration. That means we'll get 97% in all likelihood of what we got in 2016. What we're looking at for 2018, based on the numbers that we're seeing now that they've clarified a bit, we'll probably see, give or take, a 95% proration, meaning we'll get 95% of the funding in comparison to 2017 that we become available. And the problem we're faced with this, and why the prorations, is that even though the funding amount might be somewhat higher, our rents are doing this, right? So the subsidy amount for the clients is going up because we have to reflect the higher cost for them in the rental market. And then we're seeing maybe flat or basically the amounts of funds provided like this. And so the way you make up that gap between my fingers and my elbow is the only way we can do that is we have to cut back on the number of households we can assist. Unless other funding were to flow in the program, it's the only way we can adjust to it. So it does have an impact on us relative to the number of clients we'll be able to benefit. And it becomes important, we're a diverse community. We've seen that in terms of the statistics, and it's interesting to see, somewhat surprising, that in Arvada we have a poverty, the percentage of the households in Arvada, or residents in the household, residents in the city that are below the poverty line are right around 9.5%. And the value of these programs, obviously for us and for you in addressing the needs in the community, it allows us funding resources that have helped to try to deal with that population.
Mr. Marriott?
Yeah, Mr. Talbot,
Yes,
let me
sir.
ask you another question. Go back that one slide back. You can push the button you've been pushing all night. There you go.
And you noticed, huh?
Not that one.
Keep going?
No, you need to go forward now.
Oh, forward.
No, you went back too far. One more. That one.
Yes, sir.
So this slide shows that 9.5% of Arvada residents, their income was below the poverty level in 2015.
Correct.
I think it's logical to think that some people are below the poverty level temporarily, and some people are below the poverty level all the time. Do you have any idea that 9.5% breakdown, how that works out? In other words, someone who loses their employment and doesn't find sufficient re-employment for 6-7 months probably is below the poverty level for that year, but if they find re-employment at what they had before, they're probably out of it then, and that may be just a blip, where there's other people who are chronically below the poverty level, which means year after year after year they've got the same kind of prospects. So I would assume that 9.5% number breaks down into those two categories or that way. Do you have any idea how that might
And
what that
I
might
guess I
actually
would
look
call
like?
it the churn. We have people that fall into poverty, people fall out of poverty, in terms of, so the idea would be, well, how many of the folks that might be in that number, if I'm getting to your question, might be consistently at that level, and what proportion maybe come in and
That's
come
right.
out, and
That's
come in,
right.
come out. That I don't have a number for, but maybe one illustrative number might be, when we look at our Section 8 program, which is geared to very low income households, 40% of those households we assist right now are elderly households. In all likelihood, for the most part, those households are remaining at a very low income level and not popping in and popping out.
And what is that number that's the poverty level or the very low income level, or, you know, what is that household income that makes that?
Interestingly enough, I think I brought that sheet. So for 2016, the federal poverty level for our area would say for, I hope I'm reading this right. Bear with me a second. For a household size of 1, you'd be looking at 11,770. For a household size of 4, you'd be looking at 24,250. 6, 32,570 as example for 2016.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Thank you for asking a question I had the data sheet here for. Thanks.
You're always well prepared, Mr. Talbot.
Well, wait. The presentation's not over yet.
Excuse me. Can I
Looking
ask
at the
a
Arvada
question?
Section 8 program,
Nancy's got a
I
question.
just
Oh, I'm
have a
sorry.
question. You mentioned that 40% were elderly. Do you have an idea of how many are disabled?
we have a, that's a good question. We actually have a count. God, I think I planted you guys. So I can give you some numbers from the program percentages in July of 2016, recognizing these percentages overlap, okay? You could have an elderly person who's disabled, okay? So in July of 2016, we were at 36%, I said 40, okay? 36% were elderly households. Disabled handicap were 48%. Not all of those are obviously applied to elderly. 78% were households with a female head, 29% were minority households, and households classified as extremely, and this is extremely low income, this gets actually below the level that we have to be at, is at 78%. So the program really deals with very low income households in the community. So this chart, it's just trying to show, and we use 2015 because in 2016 we've managed to hold it fairly constant, and I won't go into how we pull that off. But you can see we have a baseline count we can do in Section 8 of assisting 508 households. We've declined at the end of 2015 to about 472. That's because of, again, we're seeing the increase in rents, the funding levels we were getting, and we've had to bring that level of assistance we are by contract allowed to assist down. 2016, we actually stayed relatively stable. But then we're looking forward to 2017 and 2018. Remember those proration numbers. So we'll probably see this number decline to some degree because rents certainly have gone up. The amount of assistance per household tends to go up as well with those rents. So other high-level impacts I can't speak to as well, but looking at that blueprint, there was a recommended 20% cut to local emergency management programs, and then also the National Flood Insurance Program was looking on a national basis at a $190 million cut. Again, these are just illustrative, a couple of the impacts that are out there. So this brought us to the last slide, obviously with questions you might have, but kind of trying to alert you to what we're taking a look at, the value of the programs, the potential impacts, but maybe take a look at your questions, any information requests. And Councilman Marriott had a couple questions, for example, or any actions you may want to just kick around in terms of a discussion at this point.
John Marriott.
So maybe this is a little bit of a question, but as we all know, the federal budget originates in the House of Representatives. The president produces a budget request. I think over the course of all 8 years of our previous president, a lot of years he didn't even make a budget request. And I don't think Congress ever passed any of their budget requests. And so I would anticipate that this is similar. So while I appreciate you looking at this and looking at what the impacts might be, I would encourage that that we look at, good to look at what might happen, but we also ought to look at what reality is, which is what budget actually gets passed, or action that actually gets taken via continuing resolutions, or however the federal government chooses to do it this time around. And so I guess my request for you would be to keep us informed of it, and I guess that would be my only request, just to stay informed. But at this point, I guess I appreciate seeing this at this point, but at this point, I don't give this too much. I wouldn't give this a lot of weight, because it's so early in the federal budget process, and given what the federal government budget process has turned into over the last 10, 15 years, that this isn't likely to be what actually happens. And I think when we get close to what actually happens, I'd appreciate probably looking at what actually might happen, not what we fear might happen.
And I think 2 points briefly, and I think that you're on base. Number one, we have not seen a regular order of business for appropriation bills with the Congress probably in 8, 10 years. What we've done is we've gotten to the point they should have a budget approved, and appropriation bills approved by October 1 was the last time we had that. It's been a long time. We've had what's called continuing resolutions. And then we get to the point finally when decisions are made. This time we'll have maybe 3 months left of this federal fiscal year in 2017, to deal with, to get our funding in here and be able to utilize it and such. Hopefully we'll get to regular order of business. But I think you're on point. The indications are we won't see regular order of business. We're going to see continuing resolutions in all likelihood as the Congress deals with its challenges on this.
Yeah, well, I would agree, and I would also say that I'd be very skeptical that this budget blueprint is going to be what the budget actually is.
Yeah, we heard from both of our senators when we were back in Washington, D.C., that while the president can propose a budget,
it's up to Congress.
They're never passed the way that they're
That's
proposed by the president, so,
As they say,
regardless of who the president is.
The president proposes and the Congress disposes.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's the exact terminology that our senators used. You're exactly right. But it's good to get, I think we should stay up on top of it. I do appreciate that we've got NLC and CML, particularly, and ICMA, because we want those city managers to have their input as well. Really watching these things at the national level. There will be very, very heavy lobbying on all these issues, and there'll be people who are standing for re-election at the national level who will be very cognizant of that influence and those lobbying efforts. So we'll just continue to monitor. I think it is good to look that from the reality that if indeed, worst case scenario, or in some people's eyes, maybe best case scenario, that funding is reduced at the federal level, what obligations are we going to have at the local level to make up a funding gap? Because these are services that are very much needed by our citizens, and so we can't turn a blind eye to it. We certainly have to be cognizant of it, and I appreciate you being a watchdog for us.
I agree, and I take my responsibility, both by your comments, that I think part of my job and my charge from you to me, the leadership obviously, is to try to stay on top of this.
That's
so
right.
we can report back and,
That's great.
and think and plan ahead.
Good. Well, thank you very much. Good presentation. And again, congratulations to you and your wife on 35 years. That's wonderful news.
I'll tell my wife I brought that up. She'll love it.
Yeah, that's right. Very good. Mr. Devon.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we're going to have a meeting on the Rocky Mountain Greenway Trail, and I believe Sarah's going to lead us off.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, City Council. Sarah Washburn was landscape architect in Parks and Urban Design. I haven't addressed you yet, but thanks for the opportunity. I wanted to also note in the audience and available for questions, we have Jefferson County Open Space representing Andrew Valdez, Open Space Planner. He is representing Jeffco, who's leading the charge as a local agency representing our partner group, as well as David Lucas, Refuge Manager from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So to give a quick update on the Rocky Mountain Greenway Trail effort, it's been about a year since we last addressed you, and we have a couple of topics to talk about. First, we'll start out with some background information, just a quick get up to speed, an update on the Federal Lands Access Program that we talked about last May, and the next steps that are necessary for us to move forward in this. So about the Rocky Mountain Greenway, as you know, it's a series of uninterrupted network of trails and transportation systems envisioned to link the 3 urban wildlife refuges in the Denver metro area all the way up to Rocky Mountain National Park. And what you see is a graphic of the initial vision of this project. So a steering committee representing state, county, municipal, and private agencies have guided the project since 2012, and Arvada has been one of those. This regional trail is divided into a number of various segments, some of which have been built, and some of which are still very much in the planning phases. The project design and coordination is led by Central Federal Lands Highway Division, or CFL, of the Federal Highway Administration. So the phase linking Two Ponds National Wildlife Refuge to Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge is the section that transects Arvada. We dedicated that last June for National Trails Day, and that segment terminates at the threshold of Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge. And what you see on your screen is an illustrative depicting what the current alignment is. So the section dotted is the section that was constructed last year and again terminates at the eastern edge of Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge. So where do we go from here with the FLAP grant? It was established to improve facilities providing access to federal lands or take us from that threshold into Rocky Flats. After City Council directive last year, the partner group applied to the Federal Lands Access Program, and the project was selected to receive funding subsequently. The funding at this point is assigned for fiscal year 2019. And since the project was selected to receive that grant funding, the project has evolved in 3 significant areas we wanted to talk about. So a trail alignment has been identified. We have a revised funding plan based on some of the criteria of the FLAP grant, and a draft intergovernmental agreement has been developed to finance an outside consultant's sampling and analysis plan to finance that through equitable contribution among project partners. We have a draft sample, scope of work for the sample and analysis plan, and we are ready to initiate solicitation through an RFP process once that governmental agreement for equitable cost share is executed. So on your screen, you'll see the original proposed alignment from 2016, the access points at the eastern and northern edges of Rocky Flats, the eastern edge being where our current alignment terminates, and the northern edge up at Highway 128, and the alignment transecting the northeast corner generally along across the Woman Creek alignment and shortening the distance between the 2 proposed access points. The new alignment has the same access point locations, generally the same access point locations. What has changed in the alignment is wrapping the route clockwise around the exclusion site, the DOE site, to avoid the Woman Creek area and to be more in conformance with the comprehensive conservation plan established for the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge. So to go over a couple of things that have changed between 2016 and 2017, we've put together this matrix. So in 2016, there were essentially 3 primary project infrastructure improvements. So there was an Indiana crossing, State Highway 128 crossing, and a wildlife underpass. Now in 2017, we have recognized that a wildlife underpass is not an applicable FLAP grant item, so we've reduced it down to an Indiana street crossing and a State Highway 128 crossing. Back in 2016, our contribution for the FLAP grant was $243,000. Because of the changes now, we're looking at approximately $145,000. And the local match a year ago, leveraging the $3 to $4 million in funds, now it's approximately $3.25 million in funds. And then again, back in 2016, based on council directive here in Arvada and all of our other partner agencies, there was a sampling and analysis anticipated. We didn't know how that would be covered financially. Now we realize it will going to be pursued through this intergovernmental agreement for cost sharing and pending cost share execution of that IGA. So again, key provisions of the sampling and analysis IGA. The purpose is to cost share for among project partners for the sampling and analysis plan. It's outside the grant scope, as we talked about, and our equitable share here in Arvada is approximately 22.5%, or $22,500, out of the anticipated $100,000 cost for this effort. The next step would be to execute an IGA prior to solicitation of proposals for the sampling analysis plan. And our other project partners are in the process of briefings of their leadership for the same IGA. So our next steps, we'd like to bring forward this IGA for cost sharing to pursue the sampling and analysis plan through the scope of work we've developed. We'd like to secure City Council direction on funding for Arvada's match of that SAP. And ultimately, we'd like to solicit the request for proposals for that sampling and analysis plan through our project partners. And again, we have Jefferson County Open Space as well as Fish and Wildlife here to help answer questions that I might not be able to.
Very good. Nancy Ford, you're first.
So you're, excuse me, you're saying here, if I'm reading this correctly, that you want to execute the IGA first and then solicit proposals.
Exactly.
And in the IGA, will it have a description of the SAP?
A draft scope of work will be available at the time of the IGA execution. I'm not sure of the current status of the scope of work. You want to come up?
Just the scope of work.
Yeah, if you'll come up to the microphone.
So the RFP is just the process that we're going to be using to retain the consultant, and we've given them, essentially the bounding box and said, this is the project, this is the program, we need someone to come on board that can execute essentially this independent confirmatory analysis that we want to do.
So we'll, through the execution of the IGA, then you'll be looking for agreement from the municipalities that are involved.
Yes.
As to whether they want to be a part of it.
No, so there's a nuance here. Jefferson County agreed to run the procurement process through our purchasing department. So essentially, we just want to get this IOU from the partners to say, hey, we're all on board of this together, we're going to sign off, and then we run the procurement process.
Okay, so we sign on, but we don't know what it's necessarily going to cost us at that point.
We've determined some general estimates, and if independently validated, the number that we came up with was shall not exceed $100,000.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. David Jones?
I'm just curious on the realignment of the trail. What was the reasoning or thought behind that? I'm sure it was good.
There were a number of factors. There's an area of concern along Women Creek. We wanted to avoid any potential areas of concern, and this was more in conformance with the comprehensive conservation plan established for public use and visitation on the refuge itself.
And then I'm trying to look at the map a little bit closer. So I know that there's a trail there on the north side of the Candela's homes there. Will this, and there's a dotted line that says that's a conceptual trail. Will these intersect, or will people from Candela's be able to walk out and get onto the Greenway?
With the Greenway Trail itself in the light green color, just for this phase, that is an effort being undertaken by U.S. Fish and Wildlife outside of the effort of the two access points. Pending their successful completion of scoping and analysis of the trail alignment, you'll see what's in the light green color ultimately constructed. Alongside of that, there's a darker green color you'll see, which represents a connection into Candelas. Could also be a potential Colorado Front Range Trail alignment in the future. The trails represented in gray north of Candelas are outside of the scope for U.S. and Fish and Wildlife at this point due to the added cost of the trail length from the previous plan.
Okay, so the answer is no at this point.
At this point, the Greenway Trail itself won't be directly accessible to Candelas, but it paves the way for a multitude of connections and connections to our trailheads we already have established in Candelas, the 2 trailheads we have.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, Mr. Devon, what do you need from us?
This was mainly for informational purposes. We were really especially interested in making sure you saw the different alignment.
Right.
Since that's different from the last time we presented this, and then also the heads up about the IGA and our contribution, which would come out to about 22,500 or so.
But our overall
Yeah.
contribution, which is, even with that included, it's going to bring us in at a lower number.
Correct.
Than what we were looking at before, because we don't have to pay for the wildlife
Correct.
underpass.
Correct.
Okay, I'm not surprised at the realignment from the perspective of knowing our friends in Westminster and Broomfield and who else gets water from? All those, yeah, so they're very protective of that water, so. That's the Woman Creek feeds into Stanley Lake, and that's the, yeah. Right? Very good. Okay, thank you for your
Mayor.
presentation. Thank you, sir. Okay, Mr. Devon, you got one more.
One more.
And you all did a very nice job. You stayed under my 30-minute time limit, so you get bonus points. And Mr. Ray, that does not mean you get their additional time, so. And I know you
We'll
won't
see.
take it.
Fair enough. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of council. I come to you this evening in my capacity as the interim executive director, simply to provide you a progress report and really a general review, which we have not had in some time, about where we stand with the Jefferson Parkway. I'd like to go through really 4 items here and briefly review, not the ancient history, but a short history of where the Parkway has been over the last 10 years. As council will recall, there was an effort that was led by CDOT in the mid-2000s that was really a larger question of whether how to connect the terminus of the Northwest Parkway with the terminus of C-470, a length of about 20 miles. And as you will recall, that was about a 5-year and $15 million effort that concluded inconclusively. In other words, that CDOT actually got to the point of a draft EIS and then determined that they would not take the process any further. And that was for 2 reasons. Number one is that CDOT did not see a way that they could actually fiscally implement whatever the ultimate preferred alternative was, understanding that they started with a range of 73 alternatives to study and choose among in between. At the same time, they felt that they could not overcome the political opposition that was certainly evident at the time in our friends with the city of Golden, and for those 2 reasons decided to publish the draft EIS as a document as known as the Environmental and Planning Study of the Northwest Corridor, and left that open for all parties to be able to use the analysis and information that they had gathered. To that end, Jefferson County, Arvada, and Broomfield banded together in May of 2008 and created the Jefferson Parkway Public Highway Authority. It's worth noting that at that time, in addition to the issues that CDOT had identified, the authority, for various reasons, decided that number one, they did not wish to create a permanent organization given the amount of unknowns about this project. So they only really created a virtual organization. They elected not to hire any permanent staff or any facilities. They had no right-of-way. They had no permitting done. They had no ability for a permanent income stream, and that's pretty much where we started from. So I'm pleased to report that in that time is that many of those issues have in fact been identified and resolved. We have worked through the process and have at this point assembled 100% of the right-of-way. Incidentally, that right-of-way is in alignment with the preferred alternative that the CDOT analysis had indicated out of those 73 starting. So the alignment that you see is largely identical to the one that CDOT had identified in 2008. We have gone through the initial permitting both with CDOT, with the Denver Regional Council of Governments to ensure that this is on the fiscally constrained regional transportation plan, that we have met the requirements with regional air quality, state air quality, and had gone through a long process to secure a major piece of the right-of-way, which abuts the eastern edge of the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge. As you may recall, when Congress initially created the refuge, Congress specifically set aside the eastern 300 feet for the sole purpose of being a transportation corridor. There were several hoops to jump through and several court battles after that, but at the end of it all is that that land has been transferred and is being held currently in the name of the Jefferson Parkway. The other property is either in the name of the Parkway, is being held by one of the 3 member entities in behalf of, or is already owned by one of those 3 entities. For example, the Southern Reach is already owned by the city of Arvada and is part of our master plan for the Highway 93 Lakes project that you'll recall. So that's kind of where we've been. I can report to you that at this point, there are only 3 or 4 things really remaining in order to be able to move this project forward as an active public-private partnership opportunity out in the marketplace. Number 1 is a process known as the 1601 study, which the authority is currently involved in. CDOT requires that whenever we connect to a state highway, and in this case of the Parkway, we will connect to 3, being highways 128, Highway 72, and Highway 93, that we, number 1, perform a future traffic study so that we understand what the impacts on the road system are going to be in this year to the year 2040. We have completed that traffic study and CDOT has accepted it. Based on that analysis, we are now in the process of identifying what improvements will have to be made as we connect with the state highway system in the form of either intersections or interchange improvements between now and 2040. That is a process that I was engaged in as recently as 8 o'clock this morning. We're very pleased with the progress that's there. I think there's a good understanding between CDOT, our consulting team, about what the next steps are, and we have a very aggressive schedule to complete that schedule sometime in the next 180 days, which would, by CDOT standards, be pretty damn fast. So, we are also utilizing a companion piece to identify other major procedural, regulatory, or environmental questions that will have to be answered in the course of design and construction. So as one example, the current design for the Parkway calls to go underneath the Union Pacific Railroad track. We have other evidence in the areas that there is some contaminated groundwater, which we fully expect to encounter as we make that road cut. The question will be is that what level of treatment will we have to make, where we'll be able to put treatment facilities, and a lot of questions that will involve water quality and groundwater regulation.
Perhaps, Mr. Ray, when you're talking about contaminated groundwater, what kind of contamination are you talking about?
There were a number of heavy industrial uses that took place on Highway 72 on the south side, many of which have been abandoned but involved industrial uses, some of which involved the injection of some of that industrial waste into the groundwater system.
So we're not talking Rocky Flats
We are
issues.
not talking
Thank
Rocky
you.
Flats. Thank you. So among those things is that we will be initiating in the very near future a noise study that will go through the residential areas through Arvada, specifically Leiden Rock and the Candelas areas. It's our intention that we will involve representatives from that area at the very beginning stages so that they have a good understanding about what will be studied, how it will be studied, what the standards are, and that's an outreach effort that we hope to begin sometime in the next 30 days. We will gather a number of those regulatory agencies, be they State Health Department, CDOT, Fish and Wildlife Service, and a number of agencies that will have some say as we move forward towards construction, with the idea of holding a community open house sometime either late in July or the first part of September. We're trying to ascertain the availability of what those agencies are so that we can determine a date. But it's certainly our intention to be able to both inform and educate the public and for them to be able to ask questions directly to those agencies about how they intend to process as we move forward. So we will be back to you on that. Another notable issue that we have is at the very northern terminus, as we cross through the property owned by the Jefferson County on the Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, located near Sim Street, Interlochen Boulevard, and 128, is property that is owned by the county. It was purchased with local funds on a project, the Jefferson Parkway, which does not anticipate the use of federal funding in its construction. Yet the Federal Aviation Administration does have some jurisdiction over that. We are seeking two actions from the FAA. Number one is a release of that property, which is the large square, white square that's at the very northern end of the red right-of-way, for a release as a non-airport use. The airport, when they originally accepted some federal money for the construction of the airport, pledged, if you will, that property as basically a lien. And so we're asking for a release of that lien so that that property can be used as a right-of-way. Separately, that will pass through an area that is identified as a runway protection zone, which is always an area of sensitivity with the FAA because that's where planes take off and land. Interestingly, there is already a state highway in their runway protection zone. It is called Highway 128. So we have been diligently working with the FAA to get them to a point of saying yes. So far, their answer has been no. And we had recently a meeting, about 6 weeks ago, where they were very clear that they were not willing to move forward absent a complete environmental assessment of the entirety of the parkway for the right of use of about 20 acres. We have yet to receive the actual detailed analysis. We had believed that we had provided good information and good analysis as to why it was both appropriate and proper for them to be able to move forward with the release of that property. We are still waiting for that answer, which was promised to us on the 1st of May and may yet show up at some time soon. So we will wait for that and see what our next steps are. If we can resolve getting through the 1601 process and getting our issues with the FAA resolved, I believe that we are in a position to be able to actively start a procurement process for a private partner to design, finance, engineer, operate, and maintain the Jefferson Parkway. To that end, the board has been looking at a permanent executive director position that would really take this project to that level. That would be able to identify the legal team, the appropriate procurement process, certainly individuals and firms that may be able to contribute, what's the right traffic and revenue analysis that needs to be done, what the implications of that are, and what role other third parties may yet play in that. I believe that it's really at that point that we will be able to make a definitive agreement as to whether this project is a go or next go. My intention is that we would all be in a position to be able to make meaningful decisions on that by the end of 2018. And that's really my report.
Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Ray. That was a very good update.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate that. I just want to go back quickly to the community outreach
Yes, please.
aspect of this. Several weeks ago, I held a community meeting in District 4, and we had brief conversation about the Parkway and about the direction. One of the things that we talked about, and some of the feedback I got from those that were in attendance, was that they felt they really wanted this community outreach to happen. And what kind of input will you be seeking from them as a result of this?
Specifically, we are looking for both understanding and education about as we move forward with the noise study, really for folks if they feel that there are particular areas that need to be studied, if we need particular sites that need to be modeled, that we can provide them information about what is a reasonable expectation about what noise and noise mitigation looks like and to what level and how the project will proceed from there. I do not anticipate that that study will be completed by the time of the first community open house that we have, but it would be in process, and that we can advise people about how it's going, ask for their feedback, and if necessary, even to modify that midstream.
And obviously, there's where this parkway's been proposed for many, many, many years, now there's homes
Correct.
within relative proximity to the parkway. And, you know, understandably, those folks that chose to live there knew this was coming through there, and they all have questions about, you know, what's been planned, has it been modeled, and so my sense is, and I guess I'm giving this more as a heads up, that there will be questions about, well, what does it look like?
Certainly.
What, you know, how will you mitigate sound, you know, so again, I think it's important that while in that first meeting we may not have all of the answers, that we seek as much input from those folks in the community, surrounding community as possible. So,
Agreed.
okay. So thank you.
Thank you.
I guess a question that I have is that, and I know you're doing an outreach to the business community and to others in terms of using some political pressure, if you would, to get the FAA off the dime so that we can get closure on that portion of the issue. Would it be useful for the Arvada City Council to pass a resolution or take some formal action?
I believe, Mr. Mayor, at some point it may well.
Okay. So we'll look
And we'll
to,
certainly keep that as an option.
we'll look to you and legal in terms of that.
Absolutely.
We know that the administration is looking at projects that could certainly move forward with some assistance from not necessarily federal dollars, but at least some federal attention to moving projects forward. So that might.
Exactly.
So I think that's something we ought to take advantage of. Yes.
And also, as you may be aware, Commissioner Rozier and I are working on a meeting with the Secretary of Transportation and the folks in Washington, D.C. to see, to the mayor's point, about those projects and seeing how this particular project can get on that list.
And we wish you every good fortune in that conversation.
Yes.
Thank you.
One of the things I like about Mr. Jones is he's not afraid to ask. So that's good. Nancy Ford.
Bill, I just had a question on above, is this the land that you're, where
Yes.
right here?
Yes.
This little area? Okay.
Correct.
Very good. I don't see any other questions. Mr. Ray, I want to commend you for your years of dedication to this project. I know it's been a labor of love and a lot of time. You know, fortunately, you know, we've got a city manager and former city manager who knew the importance of this project and were able to dedicate a large portion of your time and energy to this. You've done yeoman work for us, and I'm truly appreciative that.
Thank you.
From where we were, you know, 9 or 10 years ago to where we are now is a dramatic difference. We have really put together an alignment, land acquisitions, preliminary studies, and things that has this teed up to finally get to the finish line, and
Or at least the start line.
or at least the start line. I'm always looking to the finish line. The reality of it is, and poor Mr. Jones had to deal with it today, the traffic on Indiana has become unconscionable. And it's not just, you know, residential traffic within the city of Arvada, it's the people who are up in Broomfield and Superior and Longmont and on up and down the line who need to get from that part of the world to I-70 West or whatever. And the necessity of completing this section of the Beltway is becoming more and more obvious, and we cannot take the Dick Lamb mentality of years ago that if we don't build it, they won't come. They're here, and they're going to continue to come. And even Dick Lamb has recognized that he screwed that one up pretty bad. So with that, well, it's a workshop. I don't normally take questions, but yes, I'll take a quick question. No, Indiana will remain as a roadway, as a local road. The parkway will be adjacent to the west of Indiana. And then there will be access for Candelas and Lane Rock? The access points, Mr. Ray, can you speak to the access points?
The access points will, obviously, we have to weave the street of Indiana through there. It's, in some preliminary, and engineering is about at 2%. We've even thought about using the 300 feet that we've acquired for Indiana Street and then utilizing what's Indiana now as part of the eventual alignment of the parkway. It has not yet been determined, but there are going to be both a continuing local street there as well as the right-of-way for the parkway itself. And yes, there will be access.
And one of the access points will be on Highway 72.
Yes,
Right. And then up off of 128th will be the other
Correct.
major access.
yes, there will be a
it's-
toll road.
It will be a toll road, yes. Okay, very good. I see no other questions. Mr. Devon, do you have anything else for us tonight?
Mr. Mayor, no, there's nothing else tonight. Our next council meeting is June the 5th. Our next workshop is actually not going to be until July because we have executive sessions and we don't have a workshop scheduled on June the 12th.
Okay, very good. Mr. Howard, you had something?
I had a question from the city attorney. In view of our conversation recently about the definition of meeting under the charter provisions, should we excuse Mr. McGough?
I think that's certainly up to council. If you wish to do that, just as a matter of record, we could absolutely do that.
Sure.
I would move that we excuse Mr. McGough.
We have a motion to exclude Mr. McGough from this workshop. He's out of town, correct?
I think so.
Yeah, all votes are cast. That passes 6-0. Mr. McGough is officially excused from tonight's meeting.
The reason I brought that up, Mr. Mayor, is city charter requires that council attend meetings unless excused, so
Right.
that's the reason, and I talked to Mr. Daly about what's a meeting, and we determined that this is a meeting.
You bet. Very
Even
good.
though not a business meeting.
Very good. Thank you.